Health. We've got a great group with lots of experience in remote patient monitoring. Today we're going to talk about how remote nursing care can be one of the solutions to solve many of the wicked problems that are facing healthcare right now. One of those things is the workforce shortage, access to care. So we really want to explore remote patient monitoring in a little bit different light than you typically might think about it. So very excited to explore that with you today. I'm going to be the moderator, the facilitator today. My background is I've been in healthcare most of my career. I served as the Chief Strategic Development and Marketing Officer for Vidant Health, which has now been rebranded ECU Health in Greenville, North Carolina. If you know anything about North Carolina, it's the eastern part. And we had a rural healthcare system, and with lots of hospitals, community and academic medical center and physician practices, and it was hard. It's hard to reach all the people that you need to over the geography, the size of the state of Maryland. Is very spread out, and so we really had to adapt innovation early on. And so the thing that I loved best about my work was doing care innovation and how we might reimagine the way that care is delivered. And so that's a lot about what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm just great to be here with this great group. I'm going to ask the panelists to go ahead and start by introductions, and then we'll ask you to tell us a little bit about yourselves through the poll. Has everyone had a chance to download the app? I'm seeing heads nod. Okay, great. So Simon, would you like to kick us off, please? Tell me.
Sure, thank you. Sound check, can you hear me okay?
Yes. We can, thank you.
Okay, great. Well, firstly, I'd like to apologize for the size of my image on the screen. I'm going to promise you the relative scale is not proportional to the value of my opinions and experience. I've had 28 years of experience in technology and strategy, IBM, doing large CRM system integration, customer relationship management systems when that was becoming a thing. I was at McKinsey for 5 years in the strategy area, and I co-founded the Boston Consulting Group's digital ventures business. And I left over 5 years ago to found Maya Health, which I'll probably draw on some of those experiences today. I've been measuring my own physiology since the late teens with, the polar heart rate monitor, and being a lab rat in exercise physiology labs at university, and, finger pricks and lactate thresholds and things like that. So I've always had this sort of interest in what we can learn from what's going on with our bodies. And then at the Boston Consulting Group, we really got going down this path of RPM in its form today. Having developed a digital companion for remote injections in the home for oncology patients. And that sort of then led to the launching of Maya. My experience with RPM in the last 5 years is through the lens of Mercy Virtual, who's a very large customer of ours. It's one of the country's largest chronic care programs for at-risk polychronic Medicare population. Dispatch Health is another customer, so we've seen their use of RPM and help them in their, delivering hospital-level care into the home through their rover vehicles and clinicians in their advanced care model. We have just one other example is actually a specialty clinic, advanced heart failure clinic with WashU and Barnes Jewish. That actually is an ongoing IRB where we're obviously the specialists in this case using the technology and new processes to care for their heart failure patients.
Thank you, Simon. Gemma.
Sure. Yep, it's working. My name is Gemma Lowry. I am the technology manager of digital solutions at ChristianaCare in Delaware. And interesting, I've been at this about 17 years, kind of got into virtual through my work with the EICU or our tele-ICU. And worked, internally with Christiana, with some surrounding states providing care there. And then we kind of moved on and really started thinking bigger as a system about, moving care into the home. And we were just starting to have those conversations and kind of strategizing and thinking about how do we do this when COVID hit. And, everything that could possibly be done to flip everybody to virtual started happening. After that, kind of mad dash to get everybody connected, we, kind of revisited that thought and said, well, we still think that whatever care we can do in the home, we should do. So we kind of really picked up RPN by jumping into the hospital care at home model and getting the waiver and setting that up, and really lots of lessons learned, figuring out how to move that forward. But we were also doing some of the more traditional things with, hypertension, COPD. We did some of our post-spine surgery patients for their glucose monitoring. So, lots of little forays into it, but we've struggled. I mean, in all honesty, it's hard to start those programs. There's a big cost outlay. The reimbursement's confusing. So I think the more we talk about it and share and kind of figure out this, how do we do this in a way that really serves the patients and that goal that we're really focused on, but also, be fiscally sound, to the organization, has kind of been the space that we're in right now.
Awesome. Bonnie?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Bonnie Britton. I'm the CEO of Reconnect for Health, and you can't hear me? Well, I had it turned on. There we go. Can you hear me? I hear it. Okay. I'm Bonnie Britton. I'm the CEO of Reconnect for Health. I have been in remote patient monitoring. This month actually will be, gosh, I hate to say this, 26 years? Implemented the first program in North Carolina in 1997, the 15th in the country. Have worked in various, is it still not working? It must be a battery thing. Now can you hear me?
Oh, yeah.
Now I hear me. So my focus is on serving the patients. Our company is a nurse-owned, nurse-managed company that provides remote patient monitoring services to patients. And one of the things that I've seen over the course of 26 years is I never thought I'd live long enough to see Medicare reimburse. Now that Medicare does reimburse for RPM, in my opinion, it's the worst thing that could have ever happened. And the reason for that is it has changed the landscape so that the primary focus now is on the financial end of how much devices cost, and versus the nursing care that needs to be provided to these patients. So hopefully today we will help you understand how you can maximize nursing and other disciplines to overcome some of the shortages we have in healthcare, as well as focusing directly on the patient. So excited.
Awesome. Thanks, Bonnie. Well, we want to find out a little bit about you, and so that's why we put the polling questions together. So if everyone will go to the app and go down to the polling, we're going to answer the first three right now. So if everybody will go and answer the first three, and then later on in the session, we'll answer some of the other polling questions. So if you'll start with, what is your profession? Has everybody had a chance to answer the first one? Okay, it looks like our results are 37% are administrator, 5% on RPM vendor, and 58% other. Now that makes me want to ask what the other is. What are some of the others? Just shout it out. Yes?
Healthcare consultant.
Healthcare consultant? Perfect.
Office of Rural Health.
Okay, great. Anyone else who answered other? Yes. IT? Perfect. Anyone else? All right, well, that's great. Thank you for sharing that, because we want to make sure we are tailoring our conversation today such that it'll be meaningful to you. So the second one, have you implemented an RPM program? Yes or no? Have you implemented an RPM program? Give everybody a second. Everybody had a chance? It's like classroom, looking up when you're done, right? Okay. It looks like 57% have implemented and 43% have not. And then last but not least, are you planning on implementing an RPM program? And it looks like the majority are. 82% are planning and 17% are not. Okay, great. So thank you for doing that. We want today to be fun and interactive. So we're going to have a session at the end to make sure we answer all your questions. We're going to save time. However, if you've got questions as we're going along, please raise your hand. We'd love for you to just ask them whenever it's most relevant to you. So please do that. So we're going to get started today just talking a little bit about RPM. We've got a diverse audience, and so maybe everyone hasn't had the same experience. So just talking a little bit about what is remote patient monitoring and how is it most often used today. And these first few questions I'm going to ask to all the panelists, so whoever wants to jump in first, feel free. So where do you see RPM being used most often today?
My mic keeps dying, but now it's on. Historically, it had always been within home health agencies. That's where remote patient monitoring got its start. What I'm seeing now in the industry is not only academic healthcare centers, health systems, but also the payers are getting into remote patient monitoring and looking to lower their overall expenditures. The other area that is rapidly growing, but is having, I believe the most challenges are primary care providers who are trying to implement these programs within their clinics. The margins are so tight that it's difficult for that group to be able to implement a program. But we're seeing that raise more. The VA is the largest user of remote patient monitoring in the United States. Jim and Simon?
Yeah, I'd say too, for health systems, we're looking at it for kind of value-based arrangements. You know, we've got, and risk lives. You know, we're getting more and more lives attributed to us, and we're really looking at RPM as a way to keep people healthier at home so that we can help with some of that cost mitigation.
Simon?
Yeah, I certainly the most experience we've had, and we see more and more of this is as Gemma said, in the value and risk settings, where there's complex chronic cohorts, particularly the top, let's say 5 to 10% of risk in a population is where most of the addressable cost savings are going to come from. And then now, you know, I think we're starting to see sort of people moving down the risk spectrum as well, sort of to the rising risk sort of area, less acute, you know, as arrangements and risk starts to be thought of on multi-year dimensions, that will probably unlock that next wave of growth. But, you know, right now it's, you know, keep the most vulnerable and risky patients, you know, out of the inpatient setting and in the home as the de facto venue of care. And then we see some really innovative models, like I mentioned, and they're not the only one doing this, but Dispatch Health, where, you know, literally you've now got, you know, business models that will put clinicians into the home. And of course, providers are doing that themselves through hospital at home as well.
I think also, Bunny and I, we were talking earlier about, you know, reducing length of stay. If we can get them home with some kind of monitoring, peripherals, whatever is needed, and get them out of the hospital setting, that's the other thing that we're really looking at, is just freeing up that hospital bed for the next person.
Yeah, and that's really changed from even like 3 years ago. The focus was decrease 30-day and 90-day hospital readmissions, and now the focus has really shifted to decreasing that length of stay and getting these patients out as soon as possible. And that's a combination of how much money hospital systems have lost in hospitals in the past, as well as the nursing shortage, because they don't have enough nurses to take care of the patients in the hospital. So as soon as they can get them out, if they can get them out at home, get a monitoring device in, and start monitoring those patients, then you can keep those patients out and decrease the length of stay, which will increase the amount of money, that revenue that the system's going to be able to keep.
So is it fair to say that in the recent years, remote patient monitoring is really changing in how it's being utilized and how it used to be, right? Especially when you first started 26 years ago.
Absolutely. For those who haven't been in as long as I have, when we first started in 1997, it cost $25,000 a home to equip a home for remote patient monitoring. Obviously, that was the only way you could do remote patient monitoring was to have a grant. Now you literally can buy devices for less than $100 or $100, $110. You can lease devices for very inexpensive amounts. So the having to have that capital outlay that you used to have. We're in a situation now that you don't have to have as much capital to be able to get in. The thing I want to make sure primary care provider practices and any practice that's going to implement remote patient monitoring is you have to know what your reimbursement rates are for your state, and then you have to know if you're going to outsource the monitoring, that the amount you're going to pay per month is less than that, and that the amount you're going to pay for your devices is less than the reimbursement amount, so that you have enough money to implement your program and have a little margin. You're never going to have a large margin. Every year CMS has decreased reimbursement rates, which makes no sense to me at all, but
We'll debate that in just a little bit.
I would add that something of sort of seeing the rise of the command center, and from a operating model perspective, away, I wouldn't say away from, but it's the evolution from having perhaps a nurse or a clinician that's quarterbacking up remote monitoring data that's coming into a clinical setting, to now large scale command centers where you've got clinicians either literally sitting together in a command center or distributed. I think most of our clinical users today are actually at home, which was largely triggered by COVID, but it's a virtual or physical command center, and that's going to become, I believe, more and more prevalent, as that is a crucial way to make this scalable and the economics to really work. At least for the large systems, of course.
Yep, I agree with you 100%, Simon. I'm seeing organizations that never would have considered outsourcing their monitoring services that are doing it now just because of the not being able to scale the program, hire nurses, train nurses, especially in states where the nurses are part of the union. And just to hire them is difficult, and then to pay them is even more difficult.
So we talk about remote patient monitoring, and we use that term all the time, but maybe everyone doesn't mean the same thing when we say that. Could you just tell us a little bit about when we say RPM? What is RPM?
Well, I'd love to start there because, number one, I would like to see the name changed. Because remote patient monitoring implies that the most important thing that you're doing is monitoring the data. Monitoring the data is the first thing that you do. If you just monitor data and escalate unvalidated data to a physician, the physician is not going to be happy. They will stop enrolling patients into your program. And so I would like to see it remote care management, because you monitor the patient, you monitor the data for anything that's abnormal. Then you call that patient, you make an assessment, you provide it appropriate education depending on what's going on. Then you escalate to a provider if there's a need for a medical intervention. And what we have found historically, only 1% to 2% of all alerts ever get escalated to a physician. Why is that important data to take back to your physician? Is because physicians are so concerned that they're going to be overloaded with data that they resist remote patient monitoring. And then if they do agree to do so, the rollout is so slow. Let me give you an example. We were working with a large academic medical center in the United States. They have plenty of funding. That's not the issue. But they, in 2 months now, they have a grand total of 5 patients on the program. Why? Because the physicians are slowing it down. So until you have to design these programs so that your physician is only referring patients and responding to escalations. So that's, I would love to see the name changed because it's outdated, in my opinion.
Well, and it's gotten more confusing because there's RPM, there's RTM, there's CCM, and it chunks it down into billable encounters versus the totality of the patient. So I think it gets really, RPM makes me crazy too, because people think if you provide an 800 number and let them call in their results, it's RPM. Like, it's not. It has to be connected. There's reasons why it's reimbursable, and letting somebody self-report is not one of them, but people don't get that. They've kind of all jumped on the bandwagon. They say I can get X amount of dollars if I educate, if I hook up a device, and if I get 16 minutes of care in a month, I can bill it. And they're not, that's kind of the last piece of setting up a practice. And the first should completely be the workflow, which involves the physician's role, you know, the RACI. What are the nurses responsible for? What are the triggers? You know, what's the escalation pattern? All these things that have to happen first before you should even get to the point about which code and what you're billing and all of that, because I think that's just really confused it, and people are making a mess of it, and I don't even think some of them know they are. They're doing what they think is right, but the blueprint is even changing, you know, from 1 year to the next, what's allowable, what's reimbursable, how else are we gonna divide it up, which I think makes it really confusing and scary for people to wanna even get into it.
Right.
So I think this is really important. I want to pause here to see if there are any questions about what the panelists are sharing, because it's really important to think about what do we need to do and how do we start a program, because many of you said you were looking to start a program. Yes, in the back.
Lonnie, you were talking about alerts and reducing the frequency of I guess you call them irrelevant alerts. How do you work to customize alerts, and what types of education do you give to doctors to explain what alerts you're going to respond to and make them comfortable with how you're going to respond to them and make sure the doctors are in the loop?
Okay, very good question. And Simon, I don't know if you were able to hear, oh, he can't hear us at all.
He can hear us, he
Oh.
can't hear the question, so if you repeat it, then he'll hear it.
Okay, so to respond to your question, it's super important to, hold on a second, I'm having a brain freeze.
That's all right. I think, I mean, I'll take a piece of that.
Thank you.
It's the protocols. I mean, you really do have to set your program. If it's a hypertension, you know, program that you're setting up, you need to sit there and have a conversation with the clinician. If they were in your office and had these results, what would you do? So if you're getting an alert, at what level do you want me to do it, the nurse to do it? You know, who handles it when? When's it an urgent, 911 call? When is it, no, you call the doctor? You know, all of those things you work out in your workflow and the division of labor and what's gonna happen. People will say, just make sure you have RPM that has AI attached and it'll do all of that for you. No, it's not. It can help sort through the noise, but you still have to set the parameters for what is important to whom. And the docs and the nurses need to be part of that conversation in the beginning. Not, here's your program and this is what you do to respond. They have to drive those answers to those questions.
Thank you, Gemma, for spurring my brain. I've got COVID brain, sorry. We always work with the physicians in a group to determine what the alert parameters are. And I'm a believer that an alert is an alert. There are a lot of people who believe there's a yellow alert, there's a green alert, there's a red alert. To me, an alert is an alert. If the patient's reading is above or below whatever the provider has set for that patient, then a nurse needs to call that patient and conduct a nursing assessment. I recommend nursing assessment versus triage protocols. It's just like a nurse at a bedside. You do an assessment, then you provide, let's say, during that assessment, we found out they were short of breath because they had Chinese yesterday. Then you provide education about diet during that call to help them make an association between what they did or did not do yesterday and how they feel today. So setting default parameters on all your patients makes it easy for the providers because they say, I agree with these parameters. Now, having said that, once the nurse is monitoring the patient, and let's say that you have a patient and their heart rate alert is set at 60, and the patient's heart rate is 55, and you call that patient, let's say 3 consecutive days, the patient's heart rate's 55, you call that patient, you conduct an assessment, they're totally asymptomatic. That's when you want to contact the provider to adjust that parameter. Because if you keep calling the patient with a heart rate of 55 every single day, they're going to stop answering the phone, or they're going to stop doing the readings, or they're going to do both. So I always say, get the physicians to approve default parameters, and then customize those parameters once you start monitoring the patient. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. And I saw another hand over here.
Yeah.
Yes.
Simon, did you want to add?
I might add to that. I think I got the gist of the question based on the good answers. One concept I'd sort of like to put out there is sort of, I agree with Bonnie in many respects, but also there's other choices, like what is the what is the optimal patient experience, or the optimal, omni-channel experience, if you like, or care model, and are you designing an alerting system or an insight system? Those things can coexist. So for instance, an alerting system might be, you don't want your heart failure patient systolic to be below, I'm not a clinician, but some number, right? Low systolic with heart failure, that's bad. And you might want an alert for that. But let's say for someone with hypertension, do you really need to know every time they're out, above 150? Maybe not, depending on the patient, but it might be very valuable at the next encounter to know that 80% of last month they were out of range each day, right? And that's going to lead to applying those insights to the next intervention and changing care and informing the care plan. And so thinking about the technology, I think, ought to be able to support the care model and the care experience, and not have everything trigger an alert, unless that is, of course, part of the care model and the care plan. And then the other thing is, I think AI is misplaced, perhaps to Gemma's point here right now, but there's a lot of power in very simple things like having, to Bonnie's point, each patient's different. Each patient has a different baseline. You can apply good old statistics to individualized baselines, and the system should be able to do that for you. Of course, the clinician should be able to override it and have their own settings. And so it is this coming together of, good analytics, ability for the user to override and apply their own clinical judgment, and then sort of having the ability to distinguish between what do I need to know every time it happens versus what would I like to know has happened over a period of time.
Thank you, Simon. Yes.
So I work for a free clinic, and we started a pilot remote program last year with lost weight, and now we're trying with hypertension. We do have a partner that is providing us the platform. We buy the devices. But the nurses were very concerned, especially at the beginning, because we are like a private care setting that open 8 to 5 and not open in the weekend. Is the liability and the responsibility of the readings, for example, over the weekend or during the night?
I can respond to that.
Okay, and I'll just repeat the question real quickly. So they've got a clinic, and they have just started with hypertension, and they have 8 to 5, and their nurses are concerned about responding to alerts, or not, the liability around not seeing the alerts on the weekends or in the evenings. Okay, Bonnie?
So if you set your program up correctly, there is no liability. Number one, remote patient monitoring is not an emergency response system. Number two, you explain to the patient the hours that they're going to be monitored. And then third, the most important thing is helping the patients to understand what is normal, what is abnormal, and what to do after hours and on weekends. For an example, if you've got a patient with COPD, and we teach them, if your oxygen level is low, warm your fingers, recheck. If it's still low, have you taken your inhaler? If you hadn't, then do you have a nebulizer treatment? So you teach the patients how to do those things so that when you're not available, they become engaged in what to do after hours. And as long as you clearly state, either in the consent or the program, I would include it in the consent, that it's not that you're loaning them the devices, it's not a 24/7 experience. I've been doing this, as I said, a long time. I've only done weekend coverage for one customer in all of those years, and we did that for 3 months, and at the end of it, they stopped the weekend coverage because there weren't enough alerts, and then secondly, there wasn't anybody to escalate it to. So it's more important for the patient to learn what to do. I'll give you another example. My mom, who died 6 years ago now, she had heart failure and she had RPM. So she was used to doing her readings every single day. She also had a personal emergency response system. She fell 3 times. The first 2 times, she didn't use her personal emergency response system. And so I talked to her about it afterwards, like, why didn't you think about it? And she was like, well, I've never used it, so I didn't think about it. So then there was one night about 2 o'clock in the morning, Dad called and said, your mom's having chest pain. I said, I'll be right there. I was there in like 4 minutes. He'd already put the pulse ox on her. He'd already put an aspirin under her tongue. He had already checked her blood pressure and one other thing. And so by the time I got there, we already had her data. We got her through this episode. So the next day I sat down with her and I said, how did you know how to do all of that versus when you fell and you laid on the floor for an hour? What was the difference? She said, I do collect my data every day. I know what to do. I never use this, so I don't think about it.
I think that's a really good point because part of this is behavior modification.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just RPM for the sake of RPM. It's this perfect avenue of education and empowerment for the patients. The more you do it, the better they get and the more of a muscle memory they have in how to manage themselves. Down to the, I think that education piece, I think we were talking during COVID, it was Grant Central and everybody ordered millions of dollars of devices that, went out to patients and they were like, check, we're doing RPM. And the patients didn't know what to do with them. They're kind of glorified doorstops. And, in some homes now we're in a closet or in a drawer because they missed the education and they didn't set up a really thorough plan for how they were going to manage it. They said, the vendor said, I can do all of this, and they believed it and said, there you go, we're in the game, and we can bill for it, and it was just missing elements that actually allow good adoption. Go ahead.
So I wonder if it's useful to start thinking about RPM as sort of post-acute or chronic condition management.
Yes.
As opposed to self-monitored blood pressure programs.
Yes.
Which I think is what you're trying to do. Okay.
Yeah, we are doing chronic care now.
But I mean, if you are engaging your patients in a self-monitored blood pressure program, that has a beginning, a middle, and an end because you should be getting the patient to control. So that's what I mean by SMBP versus remote patient monitoring where folks are post-acute or they're in a heart failure situation or something like that or a COPD situation where they're going to need that's chronic care management as opposed to getting you to a point where you're at control. And I think those of us in the SMBP world, where I live like 24/7, we get a little bit about using RPM as a blanket because it's stopping us getting payment, honestly, because the payers are not necessarily on board, and these programs require staff, they require resources, they require much more than just a blood pressure cuff.
Amen.
So Simon, we had someone in the audience say, can we look at RPM more with chronic management or with disease management versus hypertension and trying to get from uncontrolled to controlled? So I think all these points are great responses to a question I was going to ask, like what's different about RPM model versus some of the other care models that we have today? And so we're really starting to think about that. Would you guys like to add anything else about where it may be better used? Simon.
Well, I think I actually caught most of that last comment from the member in the audience there, which is spot on, I thought. And in effect, I think there should be no RPM. It's a tool. And this sort of we'll get to the future, I think, later, but I really personally see it as more of, it should be adaptive, right? So you could move someone from a self-managed hypertension program and then be in CCM because they're the trajectory is such that, okay, now we need an increased level of care and resources. You know, you think from an operational perspective, you're managing sort of staffing thresholds, and you've had a you know, more automated, less human capital intensive self-managed program, but you're still going to have humans involved, right? Just less often. And that the technology in the home and the means of engagement may not change, but the intensity of that care will be adaptive, or ought to be adaptive, depending on where they are. And people can, you know, we've seen heart failure patients be really very high levels of acuity and very high levels of risk of rehospitalization, and then they get well managed, and you can sort of de-escalate them, so to speak, which really means you're unlikely to be spending as much you know, nursing time or as much time intervening. But the more that can sort of be just seamless and intelligent, and you know, you're using data to move that patient in an adaptive way, or adaptively, depending on where they are in their journey and their condition.
Yeah, I kind of think about these RPM kits now, like we used to think about, you know, a temperature probe. You know, you need it when you have a fever. You don't need it the rest of the time, but you don't want to have to run to the store to get it. So I actually see a place where this is just a tool you have in the house. And if you are, you know, having a flare-up for something and you need episodic care for 6 weeks, great. If you're chronic and you need to be on it now for the next 3 years or longer, you have it. But it doesn't, you know, it's that continuity of care. You're familiar with it. You use it different times for different situations. But it's a thing, and it's the process around how you use it that I think is where we fall down a lot, because we try to say, you know, it has to be this to be RPM, and a lot of times it's not. And I think it needs the flexibility to just be a tool that then can be applied to based on what your individual needs are. But it's a familiar tool because the patient's used it at different times, like your mom. And it's not, here, you've never seen this before, you're chronic and aren't really focusing well, but do this and we'll get you better.
Yeah, and I'll get you next. So we had worked with a federally qualified health center in Eastern North Carolina, and they received an FCC grant. And we were able to, because it was only a year-long grant, to overcome some of the barriers. We actually identified patients by running reports of patients over the age of 70 with certain conditions, and the goal was to get out 340 patients and monitor those patients for a year. We actually put boots on the ground for them, and they met 80% of their enrollment within 60 days. Then they received the HRSA self-management hypertension, and so they had to reach 1,068 patients, and they were struggling. They came to us to help with that. We started 16 months ago, and we're up to 960 patients. And the point I'm getting here is your conceptual model has to be different for each type of program. So the conceptual model for the FCC was a call campaign, boots on the ground. The conceptual model for the hypertension is identifying the patients in the clinic, giving them the devices in the clinic, and educating them.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment. I haven't been in it as long as Bonnie, but same situation. 15 years ago, my mom had CHF. Supposed to write her weight down, and she didn't want to do it because she didn't want to bother Robert, who was the doctor, which was my cousin. So that's when I got interested in RPM. I love the idea of changing the name.
Yes.
RPM, CCM, RTM. I mean, and all the CPT codes and everything. I mean, it should be one all-encompassing name. But just a quick comment. It's been said over and over and over. Education, education, education. This whole thing is not about devices and data. It's about educating the staff, which is huge. You know, I've got work with practices that have like 90–95% compliance. I've worked with some that have 20% compliance. It's all about that speech at the beginning that you're giving with the patient, but then it doesn't stop. It goes on and on and on. and the docs are learning, the staff is learning the whole time, and they're passing that on to the patient. So, yeah, whoever could come up with a better name, you know, I would love to think about that, but I can't stress enough, the education is how all this works.
Yeah, and the other thing too, and I forgot to say this earlier, is when the FCC grant ended, they were able to receive funds to keep it. Well, they're now phasing that program out. And so the 340 patients that were on the FCC grant, we started a call campaign with the uncontrolled hypertension patients in that group. 100% of the patients that had been monitored on FCC converted over to the hypertension program. Some of these patients have been monitoring for 2.5 years, and they want to continue monitoring. So to me, that shows the amount of engagement those patients have had, as well as the positive experience that they have had.
So you must have,
I think I think this has been touched on, but one of the things we're observing, so for instance, one of the deployments we have is 4,600 patients concurrently live every day, and there's a 2.5% monthly churn, right? Like where patients leave the program. That includes mortality. This is a pretty high risk group. So average months on program is many years, right? And that's through patient choice. They have the option to disenroll, but there's this unappreciated, or not by this group it is, but I think it's important to say there's a lot of benefit from patients in a routine, paying attention to their physiology and then starting to draw the dots, make connections, and make different decisions about diet or and the sort of self-efficacy that can build over time. And I very much agree with the front loading of that onboarding and that education and getting someone in the appropriate routine. But then there's a lot of, I think, self-efficacy that can take over time. And that's why you're able to get such high engagement and such longevity on these complex programs.
yeah, I was just getting ready to say, you must have known the next question that I was going to ask, which was, there are a lot of companies that have focused on devices and technology. And I think it's just important for us to pause and say, why is technology not enough? Because that's really where we hear the focus, and that's where we've seen the dollars go, right? Especially like during the pandemic and all the grants, people were really focused on buying devices. And we even saw one organization that bought tremendous number of devices and did not.
A whole entire state.
You want to share that, Bonnie?
Sure. So we were hired to do consulting with a state. Actually, we've done consulting with 3 states in the United States who received all of this money during the pandemic. And this one state, they went out and they bought, I think it was 2,500 devices, different devices. Some devices didn't even have an app to transmit the data. Some of the devices could transmit, but there wasn't anywhere to transmit it. Some purchased that had portals. So they had all of these thousands of devices and had no way for there to be communication of the data from the patient's home back to a centralized place or even a decentralized place. So, technology is always just a tool. It's human beings who make the difference with the technology. I couldn't take care of patients remotely if I didn't have the technology, so I value it very much. But without the nurses and the physicians and the other clinicians and disciplines that are taking care of these patients, you're not going to have good outcomes. And everybody wants to have positive patient outcomes because that's why we're nurses and, in healthcare.
Yeah, and from the technology lens, I think it's really important when you're even thinking about purchasing tech to have the right stakeholders at the table. I think, I kept catching word during the pandemic that, this doctor found this really great thing because they had a pain point and they genuinely, with the best of intentions, were trying to solve it. And I would get a call from legal, do you know about this? I'm like, what? And the contract was horrible. It hadn't been vetted. it did not have enough cybersecurity. There were so many layers of things that a clinical practice had no idea what to ask. And they didn't even know what team to pull together to make sure that they were getting the right questions, because the vendor kept saying, no, it's fine. Okay, but the liability's mine. So I think that's it. I think sometimes it's with the best of intentions, but I can see in that situation, they're like, we need 2,500 devices. No vendor during the pandemic had that many, so I'm gonna buy it from 4, with no concept that none of that tech talked to each other. Right. Some of it promised peripherals that didn't work. You know, the peripherals for some weren't covered by insurance. I mean, there were so many layers to why things didn't work. I think figure out your workflow, what pain point you're trying to solve, and then the tech needs to be a really specific group of people looking at it with really strategic questions right off the gate, and any of these top questions that the vendor can't answer, you move on. You know, if they can't integrate, even if you want to do freestanding and eventually move to the EMR, if they don't have any ability that's even on their roadmap, probably shouldn't be talking to them. If their cybersecurity, you know, insurance is, well, I think we might have 100,000, we really can't talk to them. There's just key questions that will help you rule some of them out, and then you can get to a few. Ask a Bonnie, ask an expert, call Matrix, do something and get an expert in the room to really help you vet, to just avoid misspending and then being stuck with it and trying to figure it out.
And also to add to that is to make sure there's reporting capabilities within the software. And there's a lot of software that don't have reporting capabilities. And so it's super, and if you're going to demonstrate a return on investment and to sustain your program, you have to have the capability to be able to pull reports out of the system.
I think one of the most single biggest question lists that we come across or get asked to help solve is how to make it scalable. You know what, and this is a classic people, process, and technology problem that needs, you know, to be thought through end to end and with a lot of intentionality as to what you're trying to achieve. What are the resource constraints? You know, whether you're insourcing or outsourcing, like what are the patient to clinician ratios need to look like? Because they can't be infinite, right? And then the technology needs to be able to support that intentional program design, and to ensure you're not too short on clinicians, or not having to continuously hire nurses to scale it. And so I think that pro forma of the operating model is really sort of probably the first thing that should happen. And that is a multi-stakeholder exercise. And then you're sort of fitting, okay, what do we need the technology to support in order to make that real? And then to Bonnie's point, the technology needs to have access to the data or be able to generate insights and reporting for continuous improvement, because no one ever gets this right the first time. Right. And there ought to be some rhythm of, be it monthly or quarterly or what have you, evaluation of clinical efficacy and impact and patient satisfaction and operational opportunities to improve and make it more efficient. It is very much an operational problem.
Yes, question.
She had one first.
Wait, it's okay.
Okay.
I have just heard a couple of things about vendors, and I want to make a couple of clarifying points. If you're working with a vendor that doesn't want to engage all of your stakeholders and that doesn't want to understand your program design and that did have supply chain issues and couldn't deliver for you and isn't ISO certified, those are all red flags for you. Don't choose those types of vendors. So I just, as a vendor, I want to say that, let's make sure that there aren't bad players, and we know there have been in the past. Correct.
Can I pile onto that? This is all, and this is, I'm not just because we happen to have a technology solution. My point is, I came from a consulting background, so that's really kind of, this is, everyone's making this up right now. This is not, revenue cycle management that's been or something that's very established, and so if you don't have a thought partner, or you don't have someone helping you with a selection who's a thought partner, you're going to make those sort of mistakes. It's very hard to tell things apart. People use the same words, and if you don't have a thought partner in program design and optimization, this is really where most of the value is going to come from, not the tech per se. There's certain boxes you have to check, but beyond that it's what's their model of engagement to help you achieve what you're trying to achieve.
All right, so I'm going to pile on too. And it's probably in my last comment. This is all great stuff. But you said stakeholders. I've recently worked with a practice they started about a year ago, a nephrologist, and totally fired up about it. Totally saw the value, and it has been a horrible experience for the practice because she didn't have all the stakeholders involved. The stakeholders being the clinicians, office managers, the vendor,
Yes.
the software side, the hardware side.
Right.
And having that, he mentioned a monthly, hey, how we do, and then adjust and move forward. This is a program that you just don't, I thought you were going to say on these devices, they ended up in a closet somewhere, because I've seen that happen.
Oh, I've seen that happen a lot.
We order 1,000 devices and we don't know what to do with them. They stick them in our closet. And so you need to work with, we are vendors, but I've been a consultant for a long time in this space. You've got to pull all the pieces together, ask all the right questions, and then make everybody in the group is accountable for how the program is going. That's how it works.
And some of the vendors are great because they'll come in, and if you don't have it together, they'll call you on it because they know it's going to be a bad experience. So I've had people that say, well, the vendor told us we weren't ready. I'm like, well, that's probably a good vendor, but you probably need to take a step back because that doesn't happen. Somebody else would have seen opportunity and they saw disaster. And I think that that's a fair assessment from both sides to call out when you really are not ready. Readiness makes a big difference.
So question here first, and then we've got one in the back.
So I just want to make a plug. The National Association of Community Health Centers has a wonderful toolkit. I will be honest, I have had some authorship in it, but I think it is a how-to guide for self-monitored blood pressure, not post-acute remote patient monitoring, but definitely SMBP. And there's a lot of things in there about the workflows, who needs to be involved, who the stakeholders are, and it's not telling you what to do, but giving you a tool to go through a checklist to make sure you do have, and also some guidance around selecting cuffs, around selecting a vendor, around what's actually possible in EHRs, because there isn't much available in EHRs. So I just want to make that plug. I'm happy to send it to anybody if you want to give me your email.
Sure, can you repeat that
Yeah,
organization?
National Association of Community Health Centers.
Yeah, if you send it,
And the SRE
Yeah, I was going to say,
toolkit is,
we'll attach it to the.
I have a question back to you. So what's the National Association of Community Health Centers doing to help CMS recognize that you guys need reimbursement?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I can tell you that they're actually very much engaged in that. And I can tell you that I work for a health center controlled network as a part of the federal safety net. And we have 2 pilots going right now for SMBP. One is based on the management codes, which we don't like.
right.
The other one is a per patient per month fee for the patients who are actually enrolled in the program, and we have to send data over to prove that.
Uh-huh.
But what we have pledged to them is that these patients will pretty much have reached control of their blood pressure in a 4-month period. Do you know what the control, how long it takes to get a patient?
A lot longer than 4 months.
A lot longer. Every 13th visit on average is what we know to be intensification, medication intensification happening. So tuned, because I think we're gonna have some more data to share in the not too distant future. But,
And the community health center I'm working with, they have some really good data.
yeah.
If we can share that as well.
But I mean, in terms of getting paid,
Right.
you gotta convince the payers.
Correct.
And in my state, we have to convince the Department of Health, because that's who says it's okay to
Right.
use this money that way, so. But, yeah.
Somebody?
There was a question in the back.
Yeah, it was less of a question, but I just wanted to attest what Gemma said about vendors saying, as a vendor, saying you're not ready, I think can be a good thing. And quite frankly, before you get into a buying decision, even going through a feasibility analysis is a logical first step. And be wary of vendors that say, well, we'll figure that out later, or we'll think about that later. Think about it now, get your ducks in a row, because it will serve you well. And that's just a comment from a vendor in the room who, traditionally doesn't want to walk away from deals, but will if it doesn't make sense.
Awesome. Well, this might be a good time for us to do the rest of our polling questions. So I would love to hear what you guys think is the most challenging when starting a remote patient monitoring program. So there's several choices here. Everybody will choose one. Has everybody had a chance to choose? Okay, so the results of this question are 21% said well, it's still changing. I'm gonna give everybody a few more minutes. Everybody choose one. Okay, so identification of the RPM software was 24%. Interestingly, the patient identification enrollment was 0%. The obtaining provider buy-in, 36%. Identifying inclusion and exclusion criteria, 18%. Device delivery, installation, deinstallation process, 23%.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
both thought it was interesting that patient identification was there, not a concern.
Yeah, that's
For anybody.
very surprising
Yeah.
to me, because that's the bottleneck. I've worked with more programs that had commitment. They were going to, get 600 patients in a year, and in a year they've had 2 patients. And the bottleneck is the only people who can refer patients are the providers or the clinicians in that clinic. And vendors and others don't have control over that. Right here, and then I'll get you guys.
I was just gonna say, our biggest problem in our program hasn't necessarily been identifying those patients who are eligible, but getting the patients buy-in.
Yeah.
So, we can identify patients all day long, but when you go to that patient and say, I think you really need to be involved in this chronic care management program, and by the way, there's this additional cost associated with that, then a lot of our patients are saying, well, I don't think that I'm interested. So, it's not necessarily the identification that's the issue, it's, kind of getting the patients on board.
That's part of that first speech.
Rob?
Yeah, I would like you to rephrase your response to this in a timeline. Every one of these is a hard stop. Everyone could kill a program. But I'd love to hear from you guys. The first of all these things, the first one you gotta get is, and then the second one you gotta get is. And
Yeah, I need to list
I was not gonna weigh in, I wanna hear from you guys.
Yeah.
I can help you with that.
Okay.
No, this is great.
And I don't have glasses, so
Um,
grab my glasses.
This is what we said, we wanted to be interactive, right? So that's great. So the question is, and Simon, I don't know if you've got the questions there, the poll there in front of you, but they'd be interested in hearing from the panelists, which do you have to do first, second, third? Because each one of these things can stop a program from happening.
Yeah, there might be one missing that I think is the first, which is what is the program design?
That, I
And
agree.
maybe that's tied up in provider buy-in.
That's what I was.
There's a broad set of I think there's a set of activities that happen to get the intentionality of what's trying to be accomplished, and then from there, some of these other things sort of fall out of that.
Yeah, I agree. I believe the conceptual design is the first thing that needs to occur. Are you going to internalize it? I know.
But I
Sorry,
think,
Rob.
I think provider buy-in is
Yeah.
Right.
we need a champion provider stakeholder. If you don't have that, it doesn't matter about the rest of the stuff. They will tank your entire program.
Exactly.
That's the first.
That was my thought.
Mhm.
That's why I understand why we had 36. That was the highest response.
Yeah.
But it seems to me, of the choices you gave us,
Mm-hmm.
that has to be number one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, take us through the rest of it.
All right, let me see. That's last. Second to last.
Obtaining provider buy-in would be first. Identify inclusion and exclusion to me would be second. Patient identification. And then identification of RPM software, that's part of the process of determining who your device vendor is going to be. And then device delivery, installation, and deinstallation process, that is part of your conceptual model.
Yeah.
Because there's lots of different ways to design it. Some organizations will do the installations themselves or give the devices out to patients in their clinic and outsource the monitoring, or others may insource and insource for both. So it really depends upon your resources, both financial resources and how many nurses you have and staff and clinicians.
I agree. I think that device install and deinstall goes right up to the top to the design. We oh Lord, we had an example. We had a launch date. I kept saying in some of the design sessions, how are we getting it to the patient?
Right.
We'll figure it out.
No, we need to figure it out now.
We went all the way to every single person bought in and had no way to get it there, and the whole program tanked. And it's, part of it is that people have to be willing to listen to what's being shared, even if it's not the thing that's the most important to them. And that was a huge lesson learned, because when we did then backtrack and figure that out, the pricing of the vendor they had picked was insane. So it actually became something that changed the whole program dynamic. We didn't have the staff to insource it, so we sat for months figuring out how we're going to do this now when we could have been live. So I think that is part of the conceptual design. But any of these done out of order with the wrong people in it can also, really make or break the whole process.
And I think the other thing I would just point out is the enrollment versus identification. So it's not that hard sometimes to identify. You can run a report and say, here's everyone with greater than, fill in the blank. But I think it's that enrollment process. Like, how do you engage the patient? How are you going to give them the devices? How are you going to enroll them in the program? That is really a big piece of the success or challenge.
And I think to your point, what you were saying about the cost to the patient, that's literally been a huge, for years now, stumbling block with our organization, because to your point, we've been doing it in home health for 18 years. There's no reimbursement. The system now wants to get into this with some of the practices, and the hospital's like, well, we can't charge them a copay. I'm like, okay. And I'm like, we charge a copay for everything else. Like, why can we not? Well, because we have a history of not, so we can't now start. So even when you get the program all designed, then the finance people get in the room, and it becomes this whole big, discussion about money, but then also about, as a system, we don't feel comfortable generating new cost.
Well, and the other thing that's difficult about copays is those copays are monthly. It's one thing when you go in and pay a copay when you go in for a clinic visit, but if you have to pay a copay every single month for receiving remote patient monitoring services, that's really going to tank the program as well.
But under Medicare, you don't get to decide we're not going to charge a copay.
Sure. There are lots of organizations not charging copays for remote patient monitoring.
Yeah, we won't do that, because we think that that's going to come back and bite them in the butt. So yeah, but it becomes, you have to pick which side of it you're going to go on. So do we tank the whole program, but say that we're committed to treating people in the home because of a copay? Do we try to figure out a way to pay it for them? That's illegal. You can't do
Right.
that. So you're left with, well, what do we do? You know, the option to not charge a copay means we just take the loss. Paying it for them gets you in trouble.
Right.
But, okay, so
And our
if you
finance
don't
people
charge
say
a copay, you can't bill for that.
Yeah.
That's basically,
Okay.
yeah, so you're basically foregoing that entire
Correct.
cost.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry,
You're
I
just
should have been more
foregoing
clear. Yeah, you're foregoing it. You're saying you're doing it because it's the best thing to do for the patient, which everyone says until it costs them money.
And during copay, we've been able to waive.
Yeah.
That's about
But that's about to stop.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you about that because a lot of practices are just aiding that, you know, for obvious reasons, so, that's a fine line, and you said it's about to stop. Can you, elaborate a little bit on that?
I think it's a real risk. I mean, I think it's going to be a humongous risk for this option. If you got your devices on grant money and you've been able, because of COVID, to not do some of this charging, I don't know, Bonnie, what you think, but I think that we're going to see programs stop. I don't want them to, because I think it's still in the best interest of the patient, or people have to get really creative in how you explain your ROI. I mean, I think that's the other thing. Cost avoidance, ED avoidance, escalation avoidance, that all counts. It's
Yeah.
intangible, but you can make it tangible. We can figure out what that costs and say that this is avoiding this much money. The problem is a lot of people with budgets want to see it generating money.
Right.
So I was talking to a billing organization the other day, and I was asking them, because I want to get a clear-cut answer, and I still don't have one, but they're like, this is a service, we have a process and a program, we are trying to make this population better. And so they're not gonna, they don't have to pay a copay. You know, they are aiding that charge, and they're totally fine with that. They think that's totally legal. I hope it is. I just don't. I'd love somebody to be able to tell me.
Yeah, I think
I
it's,
agree with you. I think that's gonna bite at some point in time, but, you know, it'd be great if we had some insight on that.
The question in the back?
In the interest of full disclosure, Gemma and I had dinner last night, but one of the things we were talking about was you have to be able to distinguish between direct and indirect costs.
Yes.
And MedPAC and some of the others are looking strictly at direct costs, and you have to be able to quantify some of the indirect costs, such as escalation avoidance, such as better quality of care, better timeliness of care, things like that. And that is a lot harder and takes a bit more work, a bit more business acumen. But that's definitely where you can help show the ROI, and that's where you can bring it to the financial office in a much better way.
That's probably a good lead into the next question. So once you have a program up and running, what are some of the biggest, most challenging when you're sustaining a remote monitoring program? So if you had to choose one, is it the staff to care for the patients, having the staff to care for patients, the sustainability funding for the program, alert management, patient adherence? Which one is most challenging when sustaining a remote patient monitoring program? So if everybody will vote.
That one's mine.
Give everybody one more second. Okay, the results are 24% is the staff to care for patients, 43% is the sustainability funding for the program, 4% for alert management, and 30% for patient adherence.
Yeah, and for those, no, Rob, if you want to know what we think, my number one for me would be sustainability.
yeah, and I was saying patient adherence. It's a tie for me between those two. But we started a couple new programs this year, and the patients signed up, they consented, they were educated. We thought we were good to go, and literally if a nurse didn't call them every day and say, did you do it? Did you take your readings? For weeks before they would get it, which totally blew our model for staffing ratios in the beginning. We thought this was going to be a lot easier. We very lightly staffed it, and the nurse was going crazy, she was not happy. She's like, this is not what I thought I was doing. I thought I was checking for alerts and reaching out when people were at risk, and I'm calling like I'm their mother to remind them to take their readings because it's Tuesday. And that we had to set realistic expectations that, okay, maybe we need to communicate that, those first couple weeks of onboarding are gonna be a little rough, and then it will probably ease off. But we had miscommunicated expectations of what we thought the nurse's interaction level would be. And she's like, I don't work in a call center. Why am I making 100 phone calls a day? I'm a nurse, and then also figure out, based on that feedback, how could we better reach those patients? Because whatever we had designed was not working without the extra, hands-on approach. I'm sorry.
I'm gonna give away a competitive advantage. It's a joke. We were blessed to be able to implement our program using pre-med students from the college.
Nice.
And they were acting as patient partners with our patients. They were doing all that dirty work.
Simon, did you have something to add? Yeah, I want to make sure we don't. Do you have anything to add to that conversation?
I think today probably staffing, it goes a little bit together with sustainable funding, but we've not had such a problem with patient adherence, and somewhat been surprised with it. That I think is a combination of perhaps the onboarding, the way patients are getting identified, and then the education up front, which sets those expectations and also conveys the benefits, but then delivering on those benefits quickly. And that's easier when you've got a high risk group, when you're alleviating anxiety from whether they need to go to the hospital or not, for instance, and able to support them and have an intervention remotely or direct their care remotely. So that those sorts of experiences early on, I think, in that patient journey is very helpful. And then automation. You can automate a lot of the reminders and the prompts and so on. That's some basics. But generally, I think it comes down to given the population and the range of tasks to be done, be it engagement nudges from time to time or responding to an alert. It's really about staffing and your configuration of your protocols and your settings that fits that clinical and the operational and financial objective, and trying to square those three.
So another great point, a nurse that's saying, I'm a nurse, not a call center, that's the wrong person to be doing that.
Amen.
Right? So one of the successful practices I work with, the clinical person says, I love doing this because I love helping these patients get better. He really loves what he's doing.
Yeah.
It makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah, it does.
Don't get that person out of there.
Oh yeah, she's doing something else. She's much happier.
Question?
Sure. So you have somebody outfitted with devices. You have a patient that's outfitted with devices. How do you communicate the ongoing value of the monitoring if really the benefit may not be realizable in the lack of events? In other words, you put a blood pressure cuff on and you monitor them, and they have fewer admissions to the hospital, fewer events, fewer exacerbations.
Mm-hmm.
How do you communicate that to a patient who's otherwise not necessarily looking for that? I'm a clinician and I see it, I'm also an administrator, and it's difficult to get champions. So the second part of that is, how do you get clinicians to see the value? A little bit easier because they're looking at discrete events and measuring on their own, either consciously or subconsciously. But how do you get the patient to understand that there's benefit there when they're not seeing any of it happening?
That's a good question. So one of the things that I always recommend when you go to speak to a patient about this program or about your RPM program is that this is a program that is free of charge, that has been proven to keep patients with your diagnosis at home. Those are a few things that older people, they're concerned about how much is it going to cost me, and I want to stay home. And if you up front address that, and then it's that nurse engagement with that patient and doing that small, okay, your blood pressure's a little bit up today. Let's talk about, did you take your meds? What did you do? Did you rest 10 minutes before you took your blood pressure? And so it's that nurse and that encouraging and accepting the patient where they are and helping them to make movement. So that, number one, and I'll let you guys add to that before we get to your second part.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think when they've reached a point where they are now not having as much need for intervention, you celebrate it. You
Yeah.
don't drop them. The level of touch is less, but you still communicate, hey, you know what? I haven't talked to you since last month. You've made it 4 weeks without X happening.
Yes.
I think you have to do something. Gamification works for some people, certain populations not so much. But I think even a lot of, folks too are lonely. That's the other
Yes.
thing the nurses were getting is that they call to check on them and they're on the phone for 20 minutes to hear about their kids and their grocery shopping and what's going on. And, it ends up
Amen.
being a little social. But I think you can use that to also be the time when you express, you've done well. Let's see if we can go another 4 weeks. Use how they're doing to incentivize them to keep doing it. And then, like Bonnie says, if they backslide and have a bad week, then you call them and do that, and let's get back at it.
Yeah, I mean, and like I was sharing, those 340 FCC patients, we've called 125 of them so far who have uncontrolled hypertension. 100% have agreed to transition over to the other program. And they've been monitoring for 2.5 years. Are they adherent every single day? No. I think you need to make goals for adherence. People say adherence is 7 days a week. It's not. If you can get the patient to do, I don't tell them to do, we tell them to do 7 days a week, hoping that we'll get 4 or 5. You have to be realistic on adherence because these folks are in their home and they're going to do what they want to do. But lots of positivity, encouragement, and that's, I think the key to that is getting the right nurse and the right personality to work with these patients. Because it's more difficult to establish in that nurse-patient relationship over a telephone versus in person.
So I think I will say little notes in their chart or on their file are really helpful. Was hospitalized 3 times in the past 2 years. It's nice to be able to say, hey, you haven't gone in at all in the past 12 months.
Right.
Or, pick a milestone and be able to speak to it because not only do they think you care about them, you actually know who they are, but you're sharing something that's of value to them. Even if it doesn't have to be a long conversation, it's still celebrating a win.
Yep, and for people who, like with COPD or heart failure or whatever condition, that they're having to learn how to, with exercise with intolerance, is, okay, we're going to set a goal that you're going to get up and walk 2 minutes today. And tomorrow, we're going to increase that to 3 minutes. So it's key to meet patients where they are and then build upon that. Simon, did you want to add anything to that?
I'm not sure I can. I think you've really hit it.
And I think it just speaks to our point about it's not just the device. This is what separates the programs that actually make it, and you get that sustainability, and you've got better engagement. Is the device is the tool, but the management, the people that are managing those patients, are what really make the program.
Right. I think of it like in the ICU. You couldn't function in the ICU without technology, but the technology in ICU can't function without people. I mean, it's the same thing.
There's a few things that we've observed in sort of large programs where are observed in a part of supporting, I guess, stratification of the risk of the patients, where and the engagement expectations are different. Now this is easy, or I wouldn't say easy. This is appropriate for value-based settings where your optimization criteria are different if you're looking to build CPT codes for RPM, in that your goal in a risk-based setting is to sort of provide just the right amount of care, not necessarily get 16 readings at minimum from someone each month and spend 20 minutes on everyone's chart, right? So you get to truly try and optimize the care delivery. So through that lens, stratification of patients based on risk, and if your medical legal framework is that you're going to respond to any alert you get, then sometimes you might want data only once a week from certain patients, depending on their acuity. And you can configure the program to be stratified in terms of the intensity of data collection that fits that patient's acuity, and then also tiering of the staff. So engagement staff versus nurses. Don't have the nurses doing. Obviously, you want the system doing as much as possible from an engagement, automation, collecting symptoms in response to a vital before you then escalate it to the nurse. Systems should be doing a lot of that grunt work, but then you can also think about the tiering of engagement or coaches that are scarce and costly.
Great point.
Yeah. Yes, question?
I don't want to downplay the less tangible outcome benefits of the patient, but if your program was built upon billing the remote patient monitoring codes, how do you couch with the patient that true trigger point, which is 16 monitors a month? You don't say, I got to get 16 or I don't get paid for you. So how do you do that where you get the patient into compliance so that you can justify the program?
So there's lots of different ways to do that, but one thing is how you set up your adherence protocol. So if you're trying to reach 16 days a month of data for your clinic program, then your adherence program needs to be, if you miss readings day 1, then you call that patient for readings day 2 and day 3. And if you see that at the end of the month that patient didn't reach 16 days, you discharge them. I mean, if that's the model of your program, then that's what you have to do. But it's a very, of all the RPM programs that you can implement, the primary care provider clinic is the most difficult, in my opinion, because you've got to have 16 days and you've got to have 20 minutes. And, we've got some patients that are getting 60, 80 and more minutes, but you can only bill 3 times. So you can't stop calling patients. And I've had people tell me in the healthcare industry, we only need to monitor for them 16 days in a month. And I'm like, they're human beings. You have to monitor them consistently. And to get billed, you need 16 days.
I like a lot of what you said, Bonnie, about the conceptual model going in. So as an administrator, one thing I would challenge is that we need provider or physician champions. I think you need executive sponsorship
Yes.
from the top, and you need to explicitly state what is the problem I'm trying to solve. It isn't necessarily, just because, everybody else is doing it, don't mean you do it. It may not meet your needs at this day, at this time. But if you are looking at your quality measures and you want to have an impact on cardiovascular health, if you want to have an impact on postpartum hypertension, and make sure that the next time the patient's pregnant, we know that they've actually been chronically hypertensive, and this is not now a new experience with pregnancy-induced hypertension, then that's a reason for doing this, and that should inform the conceptual model, which again should inform the revenue and I think the revenue piece of it. To the vendors in the room, the thing that I think is very difficult for the people that I work with is any kind of revenue sharing. When we're talking about revenue sharing models, that becomes extremely difficult to hit the marks, and especially in primary care.
So one of the things that you'll hear us talk about is the care between the episodes. Talk a little bit about what do we mean by that, and why is that important, and how it's different from the rest of the episodic care that we have.
Okay, so we've been toying around for quite a while with the term of care between the episodes of care, because that's really what remote patient monitoring is. I did a presentation, years ago with, I was trying to think, Rob, help me out. It wasn't you. Was it you and Joe? No, anyway, 2 other ATA folks and we did this presentation, and it was called Mr. Joe's Wild Ride. And what it demonstrated is it showed a patient, they come in to the clinic, they have their annual appointment, They see something's a little bit wrong, so they send them home. They make an appointment for cardiology. The patient's supposed to go to cardiology appointment 4 weeks later. They don't go to their cardiology appointment because their truck broke down and they couldn't get there. So then by the time they get back to their clinic visit and the cardiologist, the primary care says, whoa, you didn't go to the cardiology visit. Why did you not do that? They order more things. The patient ends up sick. They have to call 911. They take them, transport them to the local ED. From the local ED, they're air transported to the medical center 60 miles away, where they go into the ED, then they go to ICU, then they go to the step down, and then they go home. With remote patient monitoring, you could stop all of that process right at the very beginning when the patient's identified in the clinic with early signs of heart failure or whatever it may be, to stop that wild ride. So the care between the episodes is most chronically ill patients, they go every 3 months. That's what's the standard. Well, a lot happens in between those 3 visits. And so what we have found is by providing that nursing care between those episodes of care with a physician really does make a difference in the long-term trajectory of the data. Because really, remote patient monitoring is about trending data over time. Yes, you're looking at acute ups and downs, but what you're really looking at is how is this patient progressing over time, so the physician can know whether or not they're managing the patient and achieving the outcomes.
What she said.
Well, and it really is one of the things that we have that's very different than the way that rescue medicine has been built in the United States. Because we really talk about healthcare, but we really have rescue medicine, and we're really good at that. This really helps us provide healthcare on an ongoing basis and develops that therapeutic relationship with the nurse, and makes people feel cared for. So those are things that I think when you're talking about a program, any of those things could work no matter what the disease, what the condition is. All of those things make sense.
Actually, I do have one thing. I
Yeah.
will say, it is interesting because I think it also is a little bit of it levels the playing field for some folks that maybe for a whole bunch of other reasons in underserved areas or, kids, work, whatever, can't do some of these follow-ups. They go back into the ED and they get yelled at. Why are you not compliant? Well, because life. And I think sometimes this can be that in-between tool that can actually keep people that a lot of times are overlooked or forgotten about or fall through the cracks, plugged in. Number one, they think and feel like somebody cares about them, but you catch things much sooner, which helps the system and everybody else, but it also keeps them healthier at home and less blameworthy of like what they haven't done to take care of themselves. Because we don't always, when people come in, far too often we don't factor in what's crazy in their life that they couldn't get their meds, they didn't get to that x-ray, they didn't do their follow-up. And if we can do something that we can get their buy-in to do 3 times a week at home, a lot of times that's part of the argument for how you sell it to them. You know those follow-up things that drive you crazy that you can't go, and it's a specialist visit, which is a $50 copay, and you've got to do this, and you can then use some of we can forgo a bunch of that if you do this program, and we can check in on you at home.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yes, in the back.
Just want to make one other point, that one other thing in terms of the follow-up is everybody here has seen discharge instructions. And, we were talking last night, you run the discharge instructions through a program to see how, what the average reading level, and it's 11th grade plus. And it's supposed to be 5th grade. And one of the reasons that people, go back to the ER is because they, A, either don't understand them, or B, don't want to take the time to go through them. So you can catch people like this, where someone knows they have a resource they can call or contact because of a problem like this. It's much easier, it's much cheaper, and just as an aside, not to disparage lawyers because I come from a family of lawyers, but the reason the discharge instructions are so bad is because everybody follows a template. The lawyers are just frankly too lazy to write them in a much more understandable way. It's possible. They just don't do that.
Well, I think one thing, Arian, I'm just kind of switching things, but I know we're getting close to the end of our time before we get to all questions. One of the things that I see in the future is that direct-to-consumer, because I'll share a story with you, a personal story. So I was diagnosed with COVID in July, and I now have long COVID, and struggle every single day with getting out of bed, struggle every single day with shortness of breath. And if I was not a nurse and didn't have access to a pulse oximeter, I'd be paying out of pocket to have someone to monitor my data every day, to talk to me, to make sure that I'm okay and that everything's going to be okay, and you're short of breath, yes, but your oxygen is good. And we're all going to want that as we age. And I'm way too young to be needing that at this point. But the point is, anytime you have a health condition change, it's permanent, and it's going to last, and people need support. Because if they don't have support, they're going to get frustrated, they're going to get depressed, they're going to isolate, and that's going to compound all of their problems. So I see the future as direct-to-consumer. And forget about this $47 reimbursement for a nurse to spend 20 minutes working with a patient. I mean, you know.
That was kind of a drop the mic
Well,
comment, Bonnie. We could.
I mean,
It's true. I mean, it really is true. We have to make this more accessible, and that's one of the things why we wanted to do this session with you guys today, is to really say, like, let's think beyond what we've been talking about for years. And how can we think about the future? So let's turn our attention there, because we've talked a lot about barriers and what's worked and what hasn't worked. But let's spend this last little bit of time here imagining what could be. What could the future be? And where do you see that going? So Simon, I'm going to let you kick us off on this. Where do you see the future in being able to use, and we're going to come up with a new name, but remote care, and the impact it can have on health and well-being in the United States or beyond?
Well, yeah, I think perhaps Bonnie sort of said a lot of it's just in the last comments. First of all, I don't think, hopefully we won't have the term RPM hanging around. I agree. So will be an indispensable tool to support a more continuous and preventative model of care. And I think that will also probably, I hope we'll sort of even rethink the notion of in-between visits. Actually, it's really, when do you need a visit with your clinician? And that will be personalized, and that will be optimal. It won't be every 3 months. And because you've made this more accessible, it could be today, right? Obviously, be it virtual or what have you. So I think I see that this will, RPM in the software category will, there'll be a lot of consolidation, and there'll be a sort of redefinition of the boundaries towards more of a patient relationship management capability. And in some cases, you'll need data coming, physiology coming from the home. In some cases, you don't. And it'll really be about the sort of optimal patient experience. If you were to take a clean sheet of paper to how would you design a model of chronic care, you wouldn't apply the current system to it, right? You would rethink completely if someone's living with something that's chronic, that the current model doesn't work. So that's where I see this moving to a far more continuous, preventative, adaptive, and personalized models of care that patients are escalated and de-escalated, and the system sort of adapts to their needs at any given point.
Thank you. Gemma?
Yeah, I'm always trying to think of, when I was a kid and I was watching the Jetsons, I always thought that was insane, but so cool. And now I'm like, wow, we do a lot of that stuff. No flying cars yet, but maybe. But I try to think, 30 years down the road, what's this going to look like? And to me, it feels like it's going to be much more of a connected care model. Your house is going to be enabled. This is stuff that's just going to be completely normalized. SNFs, assisted livings. There's going to be places that you can go where this is just part of care, period. These are just additional tools like a stethoscope in a doctor's bag. It's not this carve out, really complicated system that you have to navigate. You should just be connected to care based on the acuity of your current state. So if I'm suffering something that needs to be monitored once a month, I do that. If I need to be 3 times a week, I do that. But I don't have to hop in and out of programs and change models, and maybe it's from this doctor's practice, it's this tool, but if I go to a specialist now, I use something else. I just see this as being much more, the continuity of care model. But no matter where you go, if you're in the hospital, out of the hospital, we're still monitoring. You're still connected to a care hub somewhere that can then chime in and respond based on what your current situation is. We're not there, not even close, but I think that's where we're going because, and I think it's interesting as a health system because I look at this and go, if we don't do it, Amazon's gonna, or Dollar Tree or CVS or one of these others because they've figured out, Amazon used to sell books, that was it. Now they sell everything. And people have gotten so used to this instant, I can get anything in 2 days or pay more and get it in 2 hours, that I think they're going to get fed up with dealing with how complicated managing their care can be. And I think they're going to go with who can give them this full encompassing circle of care.
Yeah, because it always just is one of my pet peeves when I hear hospitals and health systems and all talk about continuity of care. We provide continuity of care. There's no continuity of care in our health care right now, is there? No. Absolutely not. No. So we've got to figure out a way to have that continuity of care, the care between the episodes. It's just one of my pet peeves.
Well, and systems that talk to each other. It's always great. You live in one state and you're on one EMR and everybody's got your information. God help you if you move. Because it doesn't all translate.
Well, God help you if you're in the same town.
Well, that's
and
too.
2 different systems.
Yeah.
Your hospital's on one and your physician's on another and your specialist is on another. Good luck, anybody communicating.
Yeah, so this isn't going to solve everything for sure, but
No.
I think, there's work to be done all over the place, but I think our RPM goes a long way to, like you said, kind of continuous bridging of the gap that happens when you get discharged or when you're going through something in your doctor's office and you just need a helping hand and somebody overseeing your care.
Yeah, and that brings me back to a question that you asked earlier, is patients not being engaged and accepting the program? And if it's a post-discharge program, then you approach the patient. This is part of the care we provide. You will receive this upon discharge. It's not a question, will you? This is our new level of care that we're providing. And you're going to be part of that. And I want to say one thing about inclusion and exclusion criteria, if I can.
Yes, please.
When we first started RPM, you had to have super strict inclusion criteria because it costs $25,000 a home to do that. It's not now. So forget about inclusion criteria. If you're focusing on hypertension, everybody with hypertension is going to get this program unless you exclude them. Every heart failure patient is going to receive this program unless they're excluded. How do you exclude them? They don't have a phone. They can't communicate to the healthcare team, or they're unwilling to do so. If they can't transmit their data, if they can't physically collect their data, or if they have cognitive issues. But I'm a believer of, if you're, as a health system or whatever your organization is, and you're going to focus on a patient population, then everybody's going to get it unless they're excluded. It makes life a lot easier for your doctors as well.
So one of the things that we did as an exercise, talking about continuity of care, if you look at everything, all the different programs we have in our healthcare systems, from the physician office to the surgery center, to hospitals, to long-term care, if you look at that model and you think, what part of the system would remote patient monitoring not be well suited for? And there's just a few things, because if you think about it, the way that we've designed healthcare is the patient who, if you're a patient, something's not right? There's something wrong, you're seeking care. The onus is on you to move to where the care is. Why don't we flip that and bring the care to the patient. And that's what we're talking about. When we talk about being patient-centered, is rethinking even the access and what can't be brought, and start ruling out, okay, well, these are a few things that can't, and you're going to have to move forward, but everything else, why not? In the back.
Can I add one
yes,
thing
please, Simon.
on the future side of it? So right now, assuming the program's designed with intentionality, not necessarily letting the reimbursement drive the ideal patient list, but there's sort of an inevitability of that right now. But RPM is sort of a next best patient type solution right now. Like who would I see today, in order of priority based on the severity of their alerts or symptoms or what have you. A future, because we RPM does end up with this really rich superset of data on the patient and how they're doing. I think a lot of it's going to go to next best action as well, which is doing more of the work, teeing up the patient and the set of potential opportunities and gaps in the care plan that might exist. Could be a missing medication against the heart failure guideline, or this patient's still on a starter dose, they should have been moved up by now. Things that can clue in the clinicians and the nurses so they can truly be top of license, and the technology ought to be really working on that next best action as much as possible. So when there is a valuable clinical encounter, there's a lot more richness that's being pulled out of the data set to inform that clinician and truly kind of give them superpowers.
Thank you, Simon. Question in the back? Comment?
Hi, my name is John Chu. I'm from the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia.
Yes.
And really appreciate this. This is wonderful. Just want to make 4 very quick points. Pediatrics is a really important area, and not to be sort of forgotten. I think that a lot of great work has been done in the adult world, and a lot of that can be actually transferred to pediatric. And it's not just the child; it's also the parents.
Yes.
So I'm just glad to see Sue help me one of the pre-sessions here today. The second point is that we've just launched an RPM program at CHOP, and one of the things that we're beginning to realize is it's about hybrid care. So it's not just RPM, it's not just the person, it's how the two can synergize together to taking care and helping the child and the family through the healthcare journey across the continuum. And the third point is that we're also noticing that maybe instead of thinking about diagnosis, and I think this is earlier to what you were saying, whether you have hypertension or heart disease, really about the aspect of care. What part of the aspect of care, such as screening, such as medication management, can I fulfill with RPM? And that will help you actually go across the whole continuum regardless of your diagnosis. And the fourth point is that it's really important for us to begin to gather our data together, aggregate our data, so that we have operational definitions that are similar, so that we can actually begin to aggregate our data as a whole. Much more powerful when we go to Washington and to respective states and advocate for policy change.
I love that. Those are 4 great points. Could everybody hear that okay? Awesome. Thank you for sharing. And, I think there's 2 more polling questions. And again, our polling questions are limited, but I'd love to get your feedback as we think about, where should we focus moving forward. Pediatrics, unfortunately, is not on there, and it needs to be. So we need to add other. But we've got
cancer.
That's right.
Cancer patients.
So the last 2 polling questions: which of the following use cases or service lines do you believe has the largest potential for benefit from RPM? So out of the ones we have listed here, if everybody would vote real quickly. Everybody have a chance to vote? Okay, we've got 21% hospital at home, 4% post-acute, 33% complex chronic disease management, 29% population health, and 13% specialty care. And then number 7 is what RPM business case driver is your organization most focused on? So choose which one is your organization most focused on. And just when we did these polls, we had to just be able to choose one thing. We couldn't rank order this, so that's why we're asking you questions this way.
So I've been sitting on this. I didn't know when to interject it. So I'm from, and it's nice to see everyone. I'm from the Health Resources and Services Administration's Office of Intergovernmental and External Affairs.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
Say that 3
one more
times,
time.
Rob.
So health workforce is a huge priority for HRSA, and I have not been in a meeting with any kind of stakeholder over the last year and a half where they haven't said workforce is their #1 need and challenge. And I was surprised to see that it wasn't actually selected as a #1 challenge, except for Simon, who actually cited it. And so I guess I'm just kind of wondering if you have any perspective about, is there something about remote care that maybe is able to better retain or attract staff? Is there something more satisfying for workers, and could being better able to sustain staffing in remote care be one of the business arguments?
Yes, actually, just recently, and I can't remember who I was speaking with, and one of their most experienced nurses in the hospital was just totally fed up. Said, I can't do this anymore. You're paying traveling nurses, 2 to 3 times more than me, et cetera. And so they were going to lose that nurse, and they had recently started an RPM program, and that nurse transferred over to that, extremely satisfied. Our company, we hire nurses that are either retired and want to work part-time, or at least very seasoned nurses. And it's a very highly positive and satisfying work environment. We've been in existence for 7 years, and we've had 1 nurse to leave. And that was because she said, I retired once, and she was doing weekends at one time that I did weekends in all these years, and she was like, I want to go to church again. But that was why. Otherwise, the nurse satisfaction is off the chart. They don't have to deal with bureaucracy. They focus on that patient. They focus on documentation, and they're done. And that's what nurses love to do. So it is a huge satisfier if you do it internally, especially for your real experienced nurses who are at the point of burnout, and I can't do this anymore. That's a great pool of nurses to pull from. Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yes.
Without doubt, we have lots of education.
Mm-hmm.
And are very rarely, especially mandatory, used at the top of our license.
That's right.
That's what I was going to say. They feel useful.
Yeah.
That's been feedback like, oh my God, I'm back to actually taking care of the patient, not taking care of a workflow, a process, a checklist. That's been a really big one. It's also really interesting for COVID now is as long as you have a license in the state that you're covering, like you can get nurses outside of your geographic location to help fill gaps that you can't fill. So you can get nurses that are thinking about retiring or, they worked for us but moved. So many people moved during COVID. Well, did you keep your Delaware license? You can pick up some shifts.
Right.
I mean, there's ways that you can leverage some of this. You're out, we've got nurses that come in that are, I need, shoulder, or I'm recovering from shoulder surgery. I'm high risk maternity, and I don't have to be on bed rest, but I sure can't flip that 400-pound patient.
Right.
They come and work for 4 months and do so you can get some of these people that float in. Some then post and want to stay there. Other ones are like, at least now I know what it is, and then become cheerleaders back on the units for the units that go, what is this? I don't want any part of it.
And there's lots of nurses with back injuries.
There's a
that
lot,
can't
backs
work
and
at
knees.
the bedside anymore.
Yeah.
And this is a great opportunity for
They
them.
keep their clinical brain going. I mean, that's the thing is, my body is sore, but my brain is bored. They can use this and still keep working for years longer.
Yeah, there's one question or a comment in the back.
Yep.
Gemma, can you comment on the command center concept and how you intermingle service lines so that it's not just maybe the virtual nursing, it's I might be
Yeah, we're just getting into that. Yeah, that's what we're just getting into. We have a command center that has virtual nurses. We have RPM nurses. We have nurses that are doing hospital care at home. And cross-training is a big deal because you also don't want people to stagnate and get bored. Because, okay, I've been doing this for a while, I've got it. I still want to be able to stretch myself. So it is about, leveraging them at the top of their license, but also giving them the flexibility to work across areas of virtual and see where their best fit is. They then become the educators for the new ones coming on board. They give great feedback. And I think that's, to somebody's point, that's one of the biggest things. Nurses in the virtual space have a voice. They actually help design the programs. They give us feedback that leadership listens to because they're not in the grind of a 6-to-1 ratio. I can't even get meds out for 2 hours. I don't have time to eat lunch, breakfast, or anything else. And I'm just trying to survive. This lets them be the voice of all the nurses on the unit. We also, for some of them, they work in the command center for so many days and they work on the unit. So that there's a constant back and forth for some nurses in some roles that they can bring both sides of the equation and they can say, when I'm on the unit, I don't like this about what I'm dealing with virtually, or when I'm virtual nursing, you're missing opportunities on the unit. So we've given them a voice that I think is resonating hugely after a couple of years of literally just being the squad that got dumped on to manage the unmanageable for a long time. We had a nurse that had given her notice, packed up her stuff. She had nothing personal left. 2 days before she left, we asked her if she was interested in virtual nursing, and she's still at the hospital. And she loves it. She's now one of the leaders. So that was a great catch for us because she was so seasoned, but she had it. Yeah.
Simon, thank you for joining us. It's great to have you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Enjoyed
Thanks,
it.
Simon.
Bye-bye.
And I'll just kind of close on, we've had so many nurses say it really brings the joy back into practice.
Yeah. And so this is really important. This is a big, wicked problem that we have to solve, and the workforce is definitely one. I just want to thank you all so much for staying.
Show the video.
For 2 hours, and if
Just minutes.
yeah. And then we'll have our contact information, or their contact information. If you have more questions, we'd be delighted to follow up with you.
Yeah, we just have a 1-minute video of a patient.
Surprised because I never knew about taking blood pressure, never check my blood pressure. It's just a beautiful way and accessible and very easy to use. And so I really find it very, very beneficial and all for it. I'm very happy with it, to tell you the truth. I would highly recommend it. And just knowing that my data goes immediately and somebody else is looking at it and collecting it, and if something is out of boundary, somebody will immediately call you and so on. I mean, where do you get the service? It's a beautiful service. So I cannot imagine anybody will. Of course, you have to do it on a regular basis. Pretty much a routine for me. So maybe some people don't like that, but I think it's great. It is great. I got in the habit of doing this every day, and just beautiful.